Hi, Mike. I'd like to welcome you onto DJ's Denim and Leather show, and thank you for taking time out to chat to me.
Oh, I'm very pleased to talk to you, Dan.
Excellent. What I wanted to ask you was a question I do like to start with. Really, what actually stirred your interest in playing music, basically?
So I didn't play when I was like a really small child at all. So it's not like there's a musical sort of history there. But I guess when we were about 11, there was myself and Mark Newbold, a school friend who ended up being the drummer in Triarchy for most of the time, and his brother Martin. And it literally was a school summer holidays where I think we'd all started listening to music. And
Yeah.
I guess we'd started out by listening to glam rock bands like Sweet and people like that, but we gravitated by then onto some progressive bands like Emerson Lake and Palmer, but also classic rock bands like Black Sabbath and AC/DC, and then later I guess Rush and Rainbow.
Hmm.
So we started listening, and we just decided to form a band. It was a school summer holidays, and we spent a few weeks doing our first music, and that's how it started.
Right. Okay. Because interestingly, I've seen online there's a date sort of mentioned as 1972. Is this the sort of period you were talking about? Is it?
That's right, yeah. So I would. That's right. That's when I was 11. Yeah. So that probably was the school summer holidays before we went from primary school to senior school.
Right. Okay. And like you say, that was Mark, and it was his brother, was it?
That's right, yeah. So the first lineup of Triarchy. So the band was always called Triarchy right from the start. So the idea of government by three persons, Triarchy,
Mm.
and there were three of us at the time, and that was the name we adopted. And yeah, and I think what was important about that early band, I think, was, I mean, this is a point where none of us could play.
Mm.
Right. I mean, we were teaching ourselves to play at the time we were writing songs. We always had this really strong commitment to doing original material. So we didn't start out by learning, all the Black Sabbath riffs, all the Rush riffs, or whatever, and going from there. We started writing our own tunes right from step one, and and obviously a lot of it was rubbish in the early days. But
Mm.
that sort of commitment to original music, that was what carried us through, I think.
Okay. Okay. So obviously, then, this is the very embryonic start of the band, um, and then I read about a demo that you did in '78.
That's right.
Can you sort of talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think this is the demo that these days we call the Ballum tapes, which I still have a
Yeah.
copy of. So this was a lineup of the band. By this point, Martin Newbold, who was the Mark the drummer's younger brother, he just wasn't so interested. He left, and we brought in another guitar. He brought in a guitarist, a guy called Derek Lomas. And so Derek and Mark and myself had been playing together, I guess, for a year or so around this time.
Mm.
What had happened during this period? I mean, as I said just now, we were certainly inspired in the early days by a mixture of the kind of sort of glam rock bands, but then very much sort of classic rock and classic metal. But we were really, really influenced by the punk explosion. And by 1978, I would say we were as much influenced by, the Clash and the Pistols and people like that as we were by sort of classic rock bands. So that
Right. Yeah.
demo that exists from 1978, it includes some of the Triarchy tracks that went on to be the staples of our heavy rock set. So it included Hiroshima, it included Suicide City, but it also included a lot of shorter, kind of punkier songs, also with a bit of R&B influence from Derek's guitar playing. So it's a very different. It's got some of that sort of classic metal stuff in it, but it's also got this kind of pop punk sensibility about it. And
Mm.
yeah, we recorded, I think, like six tracks in one day, kind of mad thing I wouldn't do now, but just basically live. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I've never really thought about releasing that. It's a very early demo, but it is kind of interesting that, as I say, tracks like Hiroshima and Suicide City were already around by then.
I'm sure it would be of massive interest. I want to pick up on something there, because I mean I've done a lot of interviews now, and predominantly with I've come onto the new wave of British heavy metal shortly. Um, Rather famously, Steve Harris of Iron Maiden said that punk had no influence in the scene
Mm.
whatsoever. However, a lot of bands I talked to are very much on the same page as you, in as much that what the punk thing did was it showed bands that you could do it yourself. Basically, you
Yeah.
could put your own product out. You didn't have to, because at that point, music. I think we all agree bands were getting further and further and further away from their audiences, in as much that they were playing football stadiums. The big bands I'm talking about now, football stadiums and such like, and Nebworths and all this sort of thing. So I think the punk thing has got a big part to play in what we saw explode around about 79 time. You know,
I think that's exactly right. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. And not only do I think that's exactly right, I mean, jumping forward very slightly. I mean, so that demo we're talking about there is kind of 78. By the time bands like Iron Maiden and Def Leppard are coming through, you know, we're kind of associated with the new wave of British heavy metal. I mean, just on a number of fronts. I mean, you know, I remember the first time I heard Iron Maiden, great, fantastic band that they are. But if you listen to that very first EP, the Soundhouse EP with Running Free on it and stuff like that, I mean, the tracks are pretty short. They've got a kind of catchiness about them, and the energy with which Iron Maiden played as well. I mean, to think that there was no influence from punk there, but if you think on the other side of things as well, and you alluded to this in your comments there. I mean, you know, Iron Maiden released that Soundhouse EP off their own back, you know, as far as I understand it, to sell at gigs. Yeah. And the first Def Leppard EP came out like that as well, and that's what we did with Save the Khan a little bit afterwards. So that idea of doing it yourself and and thinking that you could start to make a name for yourself without the support of the big, you know, multinational record companies, that was a kind of punk thing as well. And if punk hadn't happened, it's not clear to me that those heavy metal bands, including ourselves, would have felt that was a possibility. So I think on both those scores, and some of the I mean, Iron Maiden went on later to be a lot more, you know, they've extended some of their tracks, a lot more kind of histrionics and so on. But that early stuff, I think you can hear punk in it. And, you know, I know Steve Harris has said that, and I respect his judgment about his own band.
Well, yeah,
from my perspective, I think I can hear it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think we all can, especially with the with Paul Di'Anno on vocals at that point. You know, I think.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
You know, so but anyway, it's just always been an interesting sort of thing that I do like to ask artists about. You know, their thoughts. But okay, let's just do the new wave of British heavy metal thing. So here's my question, and I will just tell you what other people have said, but I'll be interested to know your take on this. A lot of people I've spoke to have said, look, we were just playing rock music, however you want to term it, hard rock, heavy metal, however you want to term it. The new wave of British heavy metal thing obviously was a terminology that came around, and it's ultra cool now to have been part of that scene. All these years later, it is a massive kudos in my opinion, and then everything you read about it. But were you really just doing your thing back then, and that was basically your take on it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. I think that is a really interesting comment that other bands have made, and I would definitely support that. I mean, as I say, I mean, tracks like Hiroshima and Suicide City, these tracks were in our set prior to there being anything you would call a new wave of British heavy metal. It wasn't as if it wasn't like, so I remember when punk hit and a lot of bands kind of, you know, immediately kind of cut their hair and started shortening their songs and, you know, making themselves punk bands. That definitely wasn't like it with us on the new wave of British heavy metal. In fact, in complicated ways, you know, I still feel that Triarchy was a little bit fringy in some aspects with respect to the new wave of British heavy metal. I can say more about that if you like. But it certainly was the case we're just playing our stuff. By 1979, when Save the Khan was recorded at the end of that year, I mean, Save the Khan, obviously, you listen to it, it's got a catchy chorus, it's a big, but it's definitely, you definitely hear it's part of a new sort of heavy metal thing. Yeah. But actually, again, around that time, I mean, our guitarist at that point was a guy called Graham Legg. I mean, as a history of Triarchy is basically Mark and myself for most of the time just going through guitarists one after the other. Yeah. And at this point, we've got a guy called Graham Legg who's playing guitar. He, in many ways, is much more influenced, I think, partly by people like Todd Rundgren, but also by sort of new wave playing, and also in the Triarchy of that period. I mean, I played keyboards. I am not a classically trained keyboard player. I was never I could never have done a John Lord, right? It just would have been impossible. My keyboard playing was closer to the kind of thing you heard in bands like Ultra Rocks, maybe even Depeche Mode in ways, than it was the classic heavy metal. I mentioned all that again, that kind of new wave influence, because I think we were just doing our thing, right? Being influenced by the bands that we liked. Some of that was Black Sabbath, some of that was, was Rush, some of that was Rainbow, but some of that was The Clash, some of that was Ultra Rocks. And that was just all coming through in the music. And then the new wave of British heavy metal scene sort of grew up around us. And we were lucky enough now, as I think of it in retrospect, to be, as it were, counted part of that, because we had these tracks that very much were heavy rock tracks like Save the Card and Hiroshima. So I think, there was a certain sense, and I think other bands around the new wave of British heavy metal might think the same thing, that they were just doing their stuff. Yeah. And then there was this scene which they could be associated with, and that was just fantastic, because there were venues to play and so on. That meant there was a crowd coming who were rock fans. But I think it was, for us, it was that way round, definitely.
Yeah. Oh, right. Okay. So, obviously, when I'm reading through, I'm trying to obviously pick up on a few things prior to this interview. You seemed to do quite a few gigs at the Red Lion, Gravesend.
That's right.
Did you play there quite often? Did you?
Oh yeah, no, that was kind of home turf for us. I mean, we lived up so basically we lived on the edge of South London. So we either went into London to play or we went slightly out. And the Red Lion Gravesend was slightly out in Kent. It was a pub in the middle of a pretty much a kind of industrial estate, really. So I don't think they had noise problems. Run by one of the guys who ran it was Terry Lee, who also did the sound. Bit of a kind of cult figure, really, in like North Kent rock music. And the Red Lion quickly became like a really important venue for the sort of new wave of British heavy metal bands who were coming up, I think, in the wave after your Def Leppards and your Iron Maidens and your Saxons. So I'm not sure any of those bands ever played there, but we did. Spider did. Vardis, I think, played there. So there was some great bands around that time, Dumpy's Rusty Nuts and so on, who were like North Kent based. And so the Red Lion became this really great venue. And at that time, the Red Lion, the stage was it was quite a relatively small pub. I wouldn't like to say, I'm terrible at estimating numbers. I don't know how many people you got in it, but I'd be surprised if it was much more than 100 or so packed in. Yeah. And with a stage in the bar, and the atmosphere was just tremendous. And Terry was, he promoted the gigs, he promoted the venue, he supported the bands. He used to come out with his PA and do PAs for us in other places. He occasionally would promote bigger gigs around North Kent. We played once with Vardis at down in the Medway towns. In a bigger gig that he promoted. So, it was a really vibrant little place, the Red Lion, and we played there. I mean, I can't be sure, but it feels like we played there at least once a month for quite a long time.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have read that you obviously, you did a lot of gigs there. I've actually been there, but I don't think it's as it was, if you like. I mean, when I went probably about 3 years ago to see Marquis de Sade there, who got back together. I don't know if you remember Marquis de Sade at all.
I do.
Excellent. Yes. Well, I went there to see them, and yes, you're dead right, on the industrial estate. Now, when we walked in there, I'm sure we were in like a back room, if you like. But
that's right.
Is that how it was back then, Mike?
No, it definitely wasn't. So if you walk, I mean, I with a later band, I played the Red Lion once it had been extended. So I think Terry took over a kind of next door premises and extended the live venue into that. So it was quite a big stage at one end of quite a big room. And then there was the bar separate. So when we used to play there, the gigs were in the bar.
Right. Okay.
There was no separate hall. I think it was way better then. So when we played there in a later band a little bit later, it was. I have to say, with all respect for what Terry was trying to do there and build the venue and get more people in there, I thought it was a bit more of a sterile space than it was when it was in the bar, when it was really hot and sweaty, and when the bikers came in and filled it up, it was just brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, I just if I've got the venue wrong, I do apologise, but you mentioned Spider. Now, I was reading there was a gig that they cancelled, weren't they? That you played and it went down rather well, didn't it?
Yeah, that was I mean, we had a really good relationship with the Red Lion, and there was a night. Spider were really popular around that time. They kind of, for people who don't know, were kind of vaguely status quo like
They
boogie
were,
band.
weren't they? Yeah.
And they were great. I mean, really great fun. And they were also really popular at the Red Lion. And then there was a night when they had cancelled on the day. And I remember Terry called us at like 7 o'clock at night, called one of us and said, "Is there any chance you can come and play? There'll be a room full of people." And we managed to get ourselves down there. And not only ourselves, but a few choice phone calls. A whole gang of kind of Triarchy fans travelled down from South London. It was a fantastic night.
Brilliant.
We did. That was a kind of step in at the last minute, and that was. Yeah, we like because we had a really good relationship with the Red Lion. That's the kind of thing we would be very more than happy to do, and that was interesting as well because one thing that was true about Triarchy was that we, whilst we were definitely, because of the core tracks we did, part of the new wave of British heavy metal, and we were very proud to be so, and really glad to look back on those days now in that light. I think because we did do some different things, not just the kind of slightly new wavy element, but when we had another later guitarist who's perhaps the most stable guitarist who had in the band in terms of how long they lasted, but also someone who I think most people who've seen us live would have seen us with this guitarist, a guy called Brian Garibaldi. The first guitarist, Graham, we only ever did one gig with him, a place called Dartford YMCA. We did one gig with Graham. He's on Save the Khan. He's on Juliet's Tomb on the first single. Then Brian Garibaldi became our lead guitarist. He was a massive fan of certain kind of a US kind of boogie and blues bands. So big fan of Little Feat. And in terms of UK stuff, big fan of Eric Clapton.
Right.
And that influence, he was a fantastic slide player, and that kind of influence started to come into the band as well. So it was a bit of a mishmash of influences, although all broadly under a rock umbrella. And I think what happened because of that was we developed a kind of fan base that weren't always exactly the same fans as other new wave of British heavy metal bands had. So like first story about, the Spider thing was we knew we were going down to play an audience where it wasn't like we were just going to play to our home audience. That was going to be a different audience, and that's why it was such a nice thing to do, and they were great. But also I remember another place we used to play quite a lot was a venue in Milton Keynes called the Starting Gate, a bit later on in the new British heavy metal time. And I remember the manager of the Starting Gate saying to us one night, we have the same people in here every night of the week because it was a rock pub, apart from when you play, and then we see this different crowd come in. And I think that was interesting as well. That I think because of our different influences, we kind of, I don't know, maybe we extended the crowd base for the genre a bit further. But
that's brilliant. It's brilliant. Just before we move on, I want to ask you this because this was something. And again, if I don't know if you want to talk about this or not, but there was a lot of pyros being used in them days.
Yes.
Now there was an accident, wasn't there?
There was. Yeah. No, we laugh about it now. It's all right.
Okay. I didn't know how if it was right for me to bring it up or not. But if you don't mind, just telling us a little bit about it.
It's a good story. And so this is going back in time, actually, prior to the new wave of British heavy metal time. This is going back to the band that I mentioned earlier on with Derek Lomas in it. We were playing a local gig. We decided to use some pyrotechnics in Hiroshima, of course. So what was we were completely amateurish about these things. So we hadn't bought a proper setup. The drummer had bought these pyrotechnics that he was going to set off by connecting up some wires at the right moment in the track.
Right.
And we did it in the sound check, and it was absolutely fantastic. It worked brilliantly, and we were really pleased with ourselves. Unfortunately, Mark Newbold, the drummer, forgot to turn the power source off.
Right.
So he connected these wires up, and then he turned the power source on, and it blew up. So when we were about to go on stage, he connected up the two wires because the power source was already on. The explosion went off in his face. And the next thing happened, of course, he's hurt. We have to rush him to hospital. Fortunately, the hospital wasn't very far away. He had some really, really nasty burns the next day. So it's not a funny incident in that respect.
No.
But I think what was we could laugh about it in retrospect now because we were so stupid the way we set things up, and health and safety nightmare. But but what happened at that point was we were playing with a band called Tyrant, who were kind of another rock band who was supporting us that night, and fortunately. Tyrant and us were really good mates, and the Tyrant, or good mates with our guitarist anyway, and the drummer knew quite a lot of our tracks. So we went on stage with the support band's drummer, and still, show must go on and all that. We still sort of played the gig.
Yeah.
And I think the only, as was quite regular at the early Triarchy gigs, in fact, quite late on in the process, the door was being manned by my mother. And of course, when we rushed Mark out after he'd been burnt with a towel over his head and trying to get him into the car to get him to hospital, she's going, "Oh, this will just be some setup they've done. Don't worry, everyone. It's all part of the show, sort of thing." And
she didn't realise. Oh, right. Yeah, I mean, pyrotechnics. I've heard so many stories where they put too much stuff in, and it's like blue, people have been like partly deafened, and buildings having to be evacuated, and oh dear, all sorts of stories. But
I mean, but it didn't. I mean, I don't think we ever used pyrotechnics again in that band. But
right.
when in the very later lineup of Triarchy, when so after Mark had gone on to other things as well, and there was me and the two guitarists and a drummer, and we did go back to using pyrotechnics again in some of the last few gigs that we did, and
right.
But that time we invested in proper equipment and took a bit more care about safety. So a lesson was learned anyway.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that story with us. I just want to move on to. I may be getting the timeline a little bit out here, but I just wanted to move on to Save the Khan. I was reading about this Wasp keyboard that you used.
Yes.
What could you just tell us a little bit about that? Because it's got a very distinctive sound, obviously.
It has. It's an amazing thing, the Wasp keyboard. So this is a period where synthesizers are really expensive, right? And so I mean, the world's completely different now. But in those days, synthesizers were expensive. We didn't have any money. I mean, we were teenagers in ordinary working class families. We didn't have any money, and we wanted to use keyboards. And so, bless their cotton socks, my mum and dad, who didn't have a lot of money, saved up to buy us this new keyboard that come on the market, which was this Wasp keyboard developed by Rod Argent Keyboards, who were based then in Denmark Street in London. So Rod Argent, the great keyboard player, his company had developed this Wasp keyboard, and what they did was they invested in such a way as to keep the cost really low. So it didn't have proper keys. It was just a kind of touch sensitive kind of keyboard, like with the keys drawn on it, as it were, and at different points you touch the keyboard. So it was set off that way. It was completely monophonic, so you couldn't play chords on it, and it allowed you. It produced a kind of quite a pure sound in its kind of resting state, and then had a bit like the old Moogs. It had various ways you could change that sound, and that's what produces the keyboard sound on Save the Khan. They were like £200 when they came out in like 1978 or something, so still quite expensive. Really democratised the use of synthesizers, and it was amazing.
Right, I was just intrigued about that because I obviously read that you'd obviously bought that in, on that track. So that was 79, Save the Khan, Juliet's Tomb, and that was yourself, Mark on drums, and Graham on guitars.
That's right. Yes.
So then, if I'm missing anything out here, we can fill in the gaps. But 81, Metal Messiah, Sweet Alcohol, and Hellhound on My Trail. Now, that's when Brian was in the band then.
That's correct, yes.
Right.
Yeah. So it's Brian on the EP, the second release, yeah.
Right.
That's right.
Because we are going to talk in a moment about some. This is really interesting for me. The fact that you've unearthed a few live tracks that we'll talk about in a moment, because funnily enough, there was a little bit of deliberation online that I was reading. A friend of mine, I'm sure you know this guy as well, Rob Grain. Yeah. Well, Rob obviously, he runs the Samson archive now, and he was having a chat on one of the social media groups about he wasn't aware of any live material by yourselves, and this is why I'm quite excited about this fact. So, like I say, that was 81. Mark left the band. Did he leave the band around about 83 time?
Yes, that would be about right, I think. Let me just put that back into my head and try and work through the timings. Might have been a little bit earlier.
Well,
so yeah, go on.
No, so all I was going to say was, again, if this is correct, what I've got down here, you did a demo in '83, Ghost of Emotion, Marionette, and Before Your Very Ears. That was yourself and Paul Gunn. Is that right?
And Mark Dawson from Legend. That's right. That's right. So what happens is the sort of the transitions here are. So first of all, we released Save the Carl and Juliet's 2 with Graham. Then sometime in 1980, we knew Brian Galibardi from school. He went to the same school as our drummer Mark, and Brian was always known to be a fantastic guitarist. And we had talked him into joining the band once before, sort of pre-Graham days. But as I said, Brian, I mean, he liked heavy rock, but he didn't consider that to be his central genre as a player. He was much more Clapton, much more Lowell George, much more Ry Cooder, and but he could really play the stuff. And so we got him in the band for a little while, but he didn't last very long. Decided to go. I think he tried to introduce us to various kind of country rock covers that we weren't perhaps so keen to do, and it all kind of fallen apart. Then Graham played with us for a while, and then Brian. He was around about. We knew him, as a friend and that, and so we kind of. Mark and I hatched this plan to bring Brian into the band as well as Graham. I don't know how, with the name Triarchy would look a bit weird at that point, but nevertheless, if for the sake of the music, we'd have done it. And actually, that lineup of the band, Graham, Brian, Mark, and myself, the 4-piece, lasted one rehearsal, I think.
Oh, right, okay.
And what happened then was that Graham left, and I think what happened there was, at the time we were pretty confused, but I think Graham's thought was that he really was keen to develop that more new wavy side of the band, and maybe go into a bit more kind of new wavy keyboardy stuff. And he saw Brian come into the band as a kind of a statement, I think, from me and Mark, that we were taking the band in a different kind of direction to where he wanted to go. Right. So he left, leaving us as a 3-piece again, just Brian, Mark, and myself. And Brian was happy enough with that, and so we that's how that band got launched. So everything we did to support Save the Calm and Juliet's Team, the first single, was done with Brian, that 3-piece. So that's the kind of
okay.
I think of that as the classic live 3-piece. That's nothing derogatory with respect to Graham. He was really important in the sound on Save the Carl and Juliet's 2. But most people would have seen us live with Brian. That was the lineup, the 3-piece with Brian, and that lineup lasted through 80 into 81, and I'll come back to the live tracks then. But that's when some live. There is some live stuff kind of in my archives, as it were, from then. And that's when we would have been playing largely around the sort of South London circuit and the Red Lion. So we also played the White Swan at Blackheath, was a fantastic venue run by the indomitable Valerie, who kept all the heavy metal bands and the bikers and the Hells Angels who come into the pub in order. It's quite amazing. And we also played there. Sometimes we used to promote our own gigs at the Dartford YMCA. On occasion we'd get out further and so on. So we were doing this this kind of, that was our kind of main area, and that's where Mark, Brian, and myself played for a long time. And then Mark decided to leave, and that was a shock because he'd been in the band since day one. And then he again was just getting into other things. He got into photography and other things. He just decided he didn't want to play any drums anymore. So he didn't leave for musical differences as much as just got fed up with playing. And then there was a period where I brought in another drummer and a couple of guitarists. So I think, sorry, I missed out stage there because I missed out stage there. Sorry. So Brian lasted quite a long time. Brian left. Then we brought in these 2 guitarists. Then Mark left, and then another drummer joined. So is that? I must have missed up the time frame there a little bit. So we go through this phase. But the main point I wanted to make was that the main lineup of the band that people would have seen would have been the one with Mark Newbold, Brian, and myself. Then Brian goes off and plays country and western. Right, he goes off and joins plays quite a lot of really good British country and western artists for a few years. And then Mark Mark. Didn't know how to replace Brian because of his kind of unusual style of bringing that southern boogie and slightly country influences in places into the heavy rock genre. So we decided to go with two guitarists, and we brought in Eddie Webb and Pete Moore. Eddie was a kind of Hendrix obsessive. Pete Moore was AC/DC obsessive. So we had this four-piece lineup of the band that continued to play places like the Red Lion and that for a while. Then Mark leaves. Another band, local drummer, a guy called Mark Annell, who's really good drummer, joined the band for a little while, and then Triarchy just all breaks up. And I think, to be honest, Triarchy's folded by around, I think it was kind of by late '82.
Okay.
Triarchy had finally sort of folded.
Yeah.
Then the demos you're talking about with Mark Dawson and Paul Gunn on them.
Yeah.
They happen after that. That's a whole other story. I can tell that story if you want me to, but that's the main Triarchy sort of story, as it was at the time, sort of finished with that collapse of the band that was trying to find its way after Brian and Mark both left. In retrospect, maybe that band shouldn't have happened. I think the things that were really original and exciting about Triarchy, there was some great playing in that band, but we started to become a lot more generic. Playing more covers. I mean, it was a lot of fun, but I think we were lurching a bit at that point. Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, if there's any more to talk about that, we will. Just one question. What happened to Justin?
Yeah. Okay. I wish I knew. I really wish I
Nobody
knew.
knows, do they? Nobody knows.
No, I don't even know. This is completely weird. So this is. I mean, I didn't mention Justin in the story I just told.
I had to ask. I'm sorry, Mike. I had to ask.
No, it's great. No, I mean, if by any freak Justin hears this, this interview, I wish he would contact me via Bandcamp, whatever. Because to be quite honest, Justin came into the band, and I think I'm getting this right. It's between Brian leaving and us then going four-piece. So I let from Brian leaving to us going four-piece with Pete Moore and Eddie Webb. But I think Justin comes in this gap because Mark Newbold was still the drummer. And Justin came in, he was a super energetic, living on the edge, frenzied lead guitarist, very different to Brian, who was so controlled and so sort of like, Clapton-y and pure in his kind of phrasing on his guitar. Justin was like this sort of more like a kind of unhinged energy parcel, much more kind of Motorheady in a certain kind of way in his playing. And it was great. And he was a weird character. Like he never really learned the songs properly. There would be a lot of mistakes. Anyway, I wanted to record a track called Rock Child, which had been in our set through the whole period with Brian. So we went into a studio to record Rock Child, and that's the version that's subsequently been released. And you can hear on that the guitarist is a lot more manic. It's a lot more kind of on the edge. Right. He was a great guitarist and a really nice guy. But he just disappeared after Rock Child. We recorded Rock Child, and he just disappeared. He just stopped coming to rehearsals. We couldn't get hold of him, and now I can't even remember his second name.
Right.
So he just disappeared, and I don't know why. I don't know anything about it. He was only in the band a short time, but he brought a certain kind of difference to the band with that kind of energy, which was was fun. But just it obviously wasn't for him.
Right. I just needed to just ask that. So if you're listening, Justin, get back in touch. These live tracks, then, let's let the people know where these were recorded, and obviously we know the lineup that you. No, actually, go on. Tell us who was in the band and where they were recorded.
Yeah. So here's the first thing that's interesting. I do not know the date these were recorded. Okay. They were recorded at a gig at the Dartford YMCA, and they were recorded on an old, type of tape recorder that you used to carry around. It was enormous, and it was just stuck at the back of the hall somewhere in the Dartford YMCA by I think Mark's sister.
Okay.
And the lineup of the band at the time was Brian, Mark, myself. Like I've said, the main gigging lineup, and trying to position. I think it must. It's either 1980 or 81. listening to the tracks that are on it, it's got all the on the of the whole set, which of course I have on cassette. So listening to the whole gig, it's got Save the Car on it. We didn't used to do Juliet's Tomb live in that lineup, but it's got Metal Messiah, it's got Sweet Alcohol, it's got Hellhound on the Trail. And so I think it was probably around the time of the second release, the Metal Messiah release. So I think it was 90. It could probably 81, might have been late 1980. And so I've got the whole set, but it really was just recorded on an old cassette recorder. So it's in truth, the quality is dubious. The playing, however, I mean, in my humble opinion, the playing, however, really captures Triarchy at its best.
It's excellent.
I mean, it's got that mixture of the kind of the sort of heavy rock sensibility, but alongside the kind of bluesy, swampy playing that I've been attributing to Brian. There's a cover of, for instance, of JJ Cole's Cocaine on there that's really good. So we've got this whole set, but as I say, sound quality dubious, performance is great. I mean, I would never have thought in a million years of releasing anything from it until recently, and I think technology has moved on incredibly in the last period with the kind of AI technology that there is in studios now, where you can target, you can separate out individual instruments from mono recordings. Yeah. And of course, this is a mono recording. So we've got this cassette, and I took it into the studio where I sometimes record my sort of solo stuff now. And Hamish Campbell, there's a studio called Sound in Edinburgh, and Hamish Campbell, who's the engineer there, is just a sound wizard. And so he worked really hard trying to get the best he could out of some of these tracks. So I decided in the end to ask him to focus on 4 tracks. Now, I should say one of these tracks actually has found its way out already, and this was part of the way in which I got the idea for doing this. When the Save the Khan album was released a little while ago, which collected together some of our old material, the record company wanted to release a little giveaway 7-inch single with it. And on one side of that 7-inch single, there's a live version of Suicide City that was culled from this gig. Yep. So it's not the first time anything's been released from this gig. And the mastering on that is quite good, but we didn't deal with it in quite the same kind of detail. We started kind of attention to separating out the instruments and getting the sound right that Hamish has done on this occasion. So I got Hamish to focus on 4 tracks, and he worked quite hard on those, and very hard on those, to get those sounding the best he possibly could. And I think now they're okay to be released. So what the plan is to release them as a live EP in a few weeks' time, via streaming platforms. Okay. That's the story.
Brilliant. I was just going to ask you now, as part of this interview, would you mind if we played one of the tracks?
I would be delighted if you played one of the tracks.
Which one would you like to be heard on this particular moment?
Oh, that's tough.
Sorry.
Okay, no, I don't know. It's fair. Well, good. Of the 4 tracks, 2 are shorter, kind of like high tempo rock tracks, Wrong End of the Rainbow and Kamikaze, and 2 are slightly longer things. Suicide City, which I've mentioned several times, a track that we did right through our time from the Graham Legg days right through, and then a track called Fighting for the Future. And I think out of those 4 tracks, my favourite track, if I had to pick one as my favourite, it's probably Wrong End of the Rainbow. Okay. Which I think is, it's got a great riff, it's catchy, it's got some fantastic guitar playing from Brian in it. And, the one that would compete with that would be Suicide City, because it's kind of something that a lot of the Triarchy fans will remember, I think, as a sort of staple part of our set. That's a longer track. It goes through various phases. I used to sort of subtitle it A Death in 3 Acts, because it moves through these 3 very distinct phases, a bit more kind of prog influenced, a bit longer. Right. But I think in the end I would go for Wrong End of the Rainbow, but Suicide City would be a close second, definitely.
Well, we'll take a listen to Wrong End of the Rainbow then. Am I right in the fact that there was a time when you were thinking of maybe doing something again with the band?
Yes, yes. There's been a couple of occasions. So when Triarchy sort of finally folded, there was this little stage afterwards where I continued to play in what we might think of as a kind of, heavy or hard rock genre. And as I said, that was with Mark Dawson, who was in a fantastic Southeast London heavy rock band called Legend. Really great band, strongly influenced by Led Zeppelin. And in fact, interestingly, Mark now is a lead guitarist in Purple Zeppelin, who are a tribute band who do half Deep Purple and half Led Zeppelin tracks. Right. And Mark owned his own studio, Gold Dust Studios in Bromley in South London. And so we had both the joy and the luxury of having, when Mark and I started working together, of having unlimited studio time. Yeah. This is both, it's a luxury, but it's also, it encourages you into really bad habits in trying to get tracks exactly right. We were joined on drums by Paul Gunn, who had been in the first lineup of Squeeze, actually. Right. Interestingly, the Take Me On Yours Pretty Squeeze. And we did some tracks together which were not conceived as Triarchy tracks at the time. We were just working on them together, but have subsequently, with the permission, of course, of Mark and Paul, been released as Triarchy tracks. So there was that period where I continued to work in heavy rock. Then that kind of ground to a halt, and I played in a kind of pop rock band for a few years, first called The Verse, then Night at the Opera. Then I gave up music altogether for quite a long time when I went to university and subsequently became an academic. The story of how things sort of kicked off again with interest in Triarchy, I mean, I just thought Triarchy had just gone into obscurity at this point. But it turned out that Save the Car and Metal Messiah ultimately were changing hands for quite a lot of money. There was kind of interest from lots of people in the history of the band. So we were contacted by a record company in the mid-90s to see if they could re-release our stuff. And I actually at that point, almost reformed the band. I say almost to explain that. So it's that we'd never recorded Hiroshima, which had been like one of our stage favourites. Yeah. And I really wanted to record that track. I wrote Hiroshima when I was 15, and I still think it's one of the best things I've ever written. It's certainly, I think, the best riff I've ever written. And so I wanted to put Hiroshima on the album. So basically, the upfront money that the record company gave us for releasing our stuff again, I sort of began to get the band out together. So I got Brian involved. Brian said, yeah, I'm in for the guitar. Mark at Newbold had not played drums for a long time. And although I think he was mildly disappointed that I took this view, I didn't think he could just step into the studio and just play. And I wanted this to be as good as it could be. So I got the drummer from Legend, who I mentioned, and we actually recorded a version of Hiroshima in Mark Dawson's studio, in the studio that I'd worked with Mark. And what we did, Mark Newman came in and did some percussion. He actually did some great cowbell and stuff on there that really lifts and drives the track. So I got the band I sort of got the band back together then to record Hiroshima, and then that came out on that album that's been released a couple of times since. Then everything goes back into obscurity again for a while. Then another record company comes forward and asks us if they could re-release our stuff. So another album got put together, the Live to Fight Again album. Mostly the same material, but another couple of old tracks got included in that. And around that time, and then again a couple of years later, when the same sort of thing happened again, when some more stuff got re-released, there was sort of, I wouldn't say we had a money offer on the table. That would be taking it too far. But from the record companies, we heard that, promoters might be interested in this. And there was talk of a new wave. I think there's some sort of festival somewhere in the north of England. And apparently the promoters are especially interested in whether Triarchy would get back together to do this. At that time, I was really in the middle of building my academic career. Which has been most of my life. And so I said no. I said, I can't. I won't do this. The first time, I'm not sure if the others would have been up for it, but I said no, and so the whole thing died a death. Then when it happened again a bit later, I'd kind of felt comfortable with my academic career by then, and I wanted to do it. And I said to Mark and Brian and Graham, let's get let's get the band back together. And we had a couple of meetings about that, but my view was I wouldn't do it unless we get the original band members back together. So Graham and Brian, perhaps featuring at the same time sometimes, or changing guitar during the course of the gig. And we talked about it a couple of times, but Brian was not persuadable. He really didn't want to do it, so we didn't do it. If you ask me now, do I wish we'd gone ahead maybe with just Graham and Mark, or something, or got someone else in? I'm not sure, but it never felt right at the time, so we never did it.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you: do you think there would ever be a time?
Oh, I would never say never, in that classic kind of phrase that.
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one. Never say never.
Yeah, and I've never say never. I mean, the interesting thing is that it's not the subject of this interview, obviously, but I mean, I've started playing again. I'm releasing material again as Mike Wheeler. I'm not doing heavy rock. Doing other things. Post my heavy rock sort of stuff, I started listening a lot more to people like Dylan and Springsteen, and I guess my new stuff is closer to that. But I still love playing. When I record in the studio, I play bass and electric guitar and keyboards as well as sing. So I feel like I could still do it. Brian still plays. He never stopped playing at all. Mark would have quite a lot of work to do, I think, to get himself back up to drum readiness. But there are certainly possibilities there. So I just couldn't say. But it would. I still think, in my sort of heart of hearts, I still think if I did it, we wouldn't be trying to build a new career or anything. It would be for the love of what we did back in the day. And for that reason, I would want to get the musicians from that period back in. And it would depend on whether Graham and Brian and Mark, wanted to do it as well.
Well, like you say never. I'm going to ask you one final question. And it's been a brilliant interview. I want to ask you this question, and I always ask this question. Have you got any messages out there for the fans of the band?
Oh, I have. I would like to say thank you to all those people who, at different times since Triarchy, we were only around for such a short period of time. Really. I mean, Say the Calm is recorded in late 79, comes out in 80. The band's, I think I'm right in saying, defunct pretty much by the end of 82. We're not around for very long. And, as I say, I had a great time then, but I was really proud of the stuff we did, but I thought we'd just faded into obscurity. And then suddenly people started contacting us. People tried to seek us out. There was a new wave of British heavy metal encyclopedia written, and we got contacted and interviewed about that. And then there was, people managed to find us and write to us from all over the world. I mean, I got an email once from a young lad in Mexico who just started listening to our stuff. But also people who had seen us in the original lineup, occasionally come out the woodwork. Just recently, a guy's come out the woodwork from Los Angeles who, asking about whether, he can get his hands on any sort of Triarchy sort of stuff. And so every now and then people come out the woodwork, and every time that happens, I have a little warm glow. Because that, it's just a really lovely feeling to think that, I'm 64 now. I was in Triarchy when I was, 20, and still we may not have ever become big. We may not have ever, reached our dreams in that way. But I think we did. We did do stuff that people still find valuable. And the other thing that I really love, part of the same story really, but an aspect of it, is that I really love the fact that every now and then someone says something to us about how they think we were much more influential than we felt at the time. I don't know if anybody, how many bands listen to Triarchy and have ever been influenced by us. Probably hardly any. But certainly it's perception of some people who still follow the band that, we were doing things a bit differently. The way we used keyboards was a bit different. Because of all the influences I've mentioned during this interview, sometimes we did feel different to many of the other new wave of British heavy metal bands. And of course it's true of many of them as well that they were a bit different. It's not like it was just homogenous and then Triarchy. But I think we did feel that we were doing things our own way. And the fact that people have kind of subsequently recognised that and sometimes think we might have actually, historically been a little bit more, I hesitate to use the word important, but maybe mildly influential than we thought we ever were. That's really nice as well.
No, it's great. That is fantastic. Well, Mike, I want to thank you so much for taking time out to talk to me.
Oh, it's been great.
And obviously wish you all the best moving forward. And I really do hope maybe that I'll have to leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Darren. No, it's been great, and thanks very much for your interest in the band and for the interview. I've really enjoyed thinking through some of those issues again.